The cockpit of the drop capsule dripped with condensation, although every gauge screamed that the interior temperature remained a precise and survivable 31 degrees Celsius. Outside, Pyrox's upper atmosphere boiled at 600. Beyond that stratum, the surface swam in an unbroken crimson smother of flame, an accidental fusion of oil-slick seas, runaway refinery blazes, and 3 equatorial volcano chains that had gone up together as though coordinated by some infernal maestro. Through a thumbnail-sized porthole, Sergeant Mara Quinn watched the hellscape swirl, feeling the same pulse of awe and dread that had followed her since mission brief. Operation Scorch Ribbon, Command had named it, as if heat were merely a streak of color threaded through a benign ribbon. In practice, it was a contest of tolerances. How long ceramic geographene exoskeletons could keep flesh from rendering, how swiftly retrofitted thrusters could thread plummeting soldiers through superheated storms, and whether a 30-minute demolition window could buy the Loyalist fleet enough time to punch the enemy blockade. The planetary defense grid wasn't the real problem. It was those subterranean fuel depots vaulted 40 meters beneath scream-hot slag that fed the orbital guns and the fleet of privateers strangling every rebel alignment colony in the system. Mara flexed her fingers inside the suit's haptic web, feeling the microhydraulics answer. Somewhere down the line, the suit's core processors sniffed the atmospheric data feed pressure, convective velocity, particulate density, and began anticipating furnace-scale heat spikes. The flex plates along her spine shivered, nanomesh turning mirror bright as it shifted to high albedo mode. She allowed herself a tight smile. 2 years ago, she'd been stacking coils of jungle cable on a logistics ship, dreaming of flight school. Now she was about to swan dive into a planetary firestorm at terminal speed, armed with a single-shot grav nuke the size of a football. Upward mobility, the core's style. A red diode flared over her visor. T20 clock. Lieutenant Zev Rourke's voice crackled on squad channel. Dragons, status check. Call in or burn up. One by one, the 6 other troopers reported green. No humor, no boasts. Everybody knew the margin lay on a razor's edge. Mara toggled her mic. Dragon 4, armor sealed, payload stable. She inhaled a breath laced with pure oxygen and stabilizers, then thumbed the safeties off her forearm blisters. The suit interpreted the sequence and exposed the microvents that would turn her whole body into an actively cooled heat sink. Above her, the magnetic clamps clanged open. Gravity reached inside the capsule like a crooked finger. Freefall hit with the intimacy of a personal betrayal. Airspeed slammed Mara into her harness, then flung her forward as the blasting doors irised and the capsule disgorged its living cargo. 7 comets in matte silver armor streaked nose first into a mantle of incandescent cloud. The first shock wave burrowed through Mara's teeth. Static auroras flickered across her HUD. Hull temperature leapt toward 400. The armor's fluidic channels gurgled as they siphoned the worst of the thermal spike outward. Immediately the outer shell blackened, shedding a roiling envelope of burnt ceramic dust that tore free and spiraled behind her like smoke from a wizard's robe. She rode the plunge in enforced stillness, trusting the suit's ailerons to keep her stable. The real flying would come later, once thrusters kicked. Winds screamed, buffeting her sideways, while turbulence shook Zev off the vector by a dozen meters. Mara's heart hammered. She could almost feel the edges of her blood boiling with promise. She whispered the drop creed, barely audible over the world's death throes. Feet first into the fire. Cut it clean. Feet first. A sonic boom rolled past, and the nav overlay stuttered back to life. Below, a churning curtain of smoke parted, showing fleeting glimpses of the surface, a molten jigsaw of cracked basalt plateaus and ribboning rivers of bright orange. Somewhere beneath that blistered crust, hidden behind false seismic echoes, the enemy's primary reservoir awaited. Satellite recon insisted the vault's lid remained intact, its self-healing alloys cooled by a refrigerated mantle of liquid nitrogen. If the Loyalists kept those tanks, they could fuel 1,000 missile volleys. If the Dragons destroyed them, the blockade's claws would dull overnight. 10:20 o'clock, Zev pinged the squad. Phase 2, wings out. Mara snapped her limbs wide. Servos answered with brutal precision. Heat-adaptive membranes extended from her arms and calves, silvery, almost gossamer, yet woven with refractory fibers that reflected 80% of thermal radiation. They functioned as both glide surfaces and radiators, bleeding stored energy in shimmering halos. Thrusters spat pale blue tails, vectoring her descent toward Rendezvous Null. Immediately, the thermal profile changed. Instead of air, they punched through flumes of pyroclastic debris. Particles rattled against her helmet, each impact a wasp sting. The suit's skin crawled with electrical false positives. A dark shape reared amid the heat haze slag-coated edifices, half collapsed but still unmistakably artificial. Old mining elevators built before the cataclysm, their skeletal frames now glowing red. Mara rolled, slotting herself between two E-beams, letting the draft catapult her into a narrow corridor where wind died abruptly. Digital dust cleared, showing the Dragon unit now only a dozen meters apart, hovering like hawks above a yawning crevasse. Zev's retinal marker blinked. There's the needle. The needle was a vent shaft no wider than a shuttle hatch, hidden in the vault. On cooler worlds, infiltration would mean plasma cutters and patience. On Pyroxis, nature did the carving. Recurrent thermal quakes had opened a throat straight to the depot's service gallery. Problem was, the throat breathed. Every 40 seconds, a pressure surge hurled a cannonball of fire and toxic gas upward, hot enough to vaporize stray alloy. To make landfall, they needed to sink the plunge between exhalations. Mara watched internal chronometers merge with shaft telemetry. T-1743, next outgassing in 6. Zev's voice, "Stack on me, 10-meter spread, 3-second offset." The squad complied, forming a staggered diamond over the vent. Mara found herself third in line. She swallowed. The theory was simple. Zev would drop, the shaft would sigh, Mara and the rest would follow in the brief vacuum pocket. If timing slipped, they'd be atomized, and the core would lose its grav nukes. "Mark!" Zeb folded his wings, became a spear of silver, and vanished into the glowing wound. Seconds ticked. A dull roar rumbled, then subsided. "Clear!" he barked from somewhere below. Dragon 2 dove. Dragon 3, Mara's suit blinked green. "Go!" She tucked throttled thrusters to nothing and let gravity claim her. Shaft walls screamed past, melted glass glimmering in the light of her helmet lamps. The air smelled of scorched copper through filter vents. 20 meters down, pressure differentials equalized, and freefall turned syrupy. She toggled inertia dampers to partial, avoiding blackout, then hit a sudden cushion of cold. Real cold, a pocket kept cryogenic by the depot's refrigeration arrays. Frost caked her visor edges. Finally, inertial sensors chirped. Altitude 0. Boots kissed metal. Mara Dragon 4 stood on a maintenance catwalk overlooking a cavern the size of a stadium. Ranks of armored cisterns filled its center, each the height of a 4-story building, veins of frost glittering on their domes. Coolant conduits webbed the walls, sighing as they struggled against the planet's furnace. The enemy had designed redundancy. Every tank possessed independent shielding, buried deeper than any orbital strike could touch. Underground fireproofing had seemed invincible, until someone in operations realized the fire itself could be weaponized, turned the planet's fury inward, and the fortress became its own kiln. Her visor adjusted, picking out motes of motion. Automated sentries tracked them, scarab-shaped drones clinging to cables, their optical turrets winking. Target overlays flared. Zev spoke softly. "EMP on my mark." Burn 10. He produced a wrist capsule, thumbed the priming stud. Mara mirrored him. The squad fanned out along the catwalk, each choosing a vantage. "Mark!" 7 miniature storms blossomed. Ion pulses crackled, shorting the scarabs mid-pivot. They dropped away like peppered beetles, clanging off ducts. Alarms stuttered but failed to mount a coherent cry. The depot's remote link fell silent. Phase 3. Sabotage. The dragons descended service ladders, magnetic boots clanking. Mara's HUD drew an invisible path toward Tank 3B. She loped along a graded walkway, dim with drifting fog. Every step felt like trespass inside a tomb. She snapped a cable into the tank's diagnostic port, tricking the local sensors long enough to authorize an anti-tamper bypass. Then peeled away an inspection hatch. Molten heat pulsed below her gloves, yet within that nest of pipes she found the target, the tank's pressurization relay. One shaped charge there, another at the opposite end, linked by remote detonator. Overpressure would rupture the vessel, ignite volatile gases, and cascade through the depot. Her squad mates worked similar rituals. Each minute stretched elastic. Sweat pooled under her collar despite the suit's wicking matrix. She glanced at the chronometer. T60 clock. Almost done. Dragon Lead, we got a situation, came Tran's voice. Dragon 6 cool, Bud edged. I'm reading external telemetry. Looks like the Loyalists started lift prep on the orbital tugs. They must have flagged our entry. Inbound troops, 3 mics out, topside. Zev cursed. Copy. We're packing. He pinged the network. Icons lit green as each trooper weaponized a tank. Mara secured her second charge, double-checked the frequency lock, then slammed the hatch. She sprang back onto the walkway, heading for Ascent Point Echo where the shaft they'd used to drop now loomed. They regrouped in under 60 seconds, but as they reached the ladder, klaxon sirens finally found their voice. Red strobes spun, bulkhead doors slammed, sealing corridors. Zev adjusted mission timers. No exfil window. We go volcano route. Volcano route meant forcing the depot's own cryo lines to reverse. If they ruptured coolant into magma pockets that threaded below, the resulting steam explosion would blast a new chimney to the surface, and hopefully launch the dragons along with it. On the L table, probability of survival hovered near 22%, but it beat waiting for Loyalist shock troops to corner them. Wrenching open a pipe manifold, Mara let Tran flood the line with directional charges. Nitrogen hissed like a nest of serpents as pressure valves warped. The squad retreated to an alcove, magnetized boots anchoring to support struts. Mara braced, forearms locked across her chest, her fingertips tingled with purely psychological cold. Zev counted down. 3, 2, execute. The world inverted. Sound arrived first, a metallic howl so deep it shook organs. Then came movement. The floor heaved up. A bolt of superheated nitrogen punched through substrata and found magma. Instant convection turned it to steam, then plasma. The depot's interior detonated. Tanks ruptured, their volatile stores lashing outward in incandescent bows. Pressure multiplied by 1,000. The alcove groaned, tore free, became a bullet of steel shooting up a newborn vent. Mara felt weight vanish. HUD-lit numerals spiked. Vertical velocity 260, then 340 meters per second. She gripped the strut as shards of cistern shell whirled past, glowing white. The suit flashed warnings, microfractures and knee joints. Coolant margin diminishing. Yet still held. Ahead, a lance of red daylight opened. For an instant, Mara glimpsed the surface, the color of a forge. Then the alcove disintegrated, and she was tumbling free in a maelstrom of ash and superheated air. Wings! Zev shouted. Mara snapped her limbs out. The membranes redeployed, catching turbulence, leveraging it into lift. She rolled, found horizon, slowed her spin. Flames sheeted beneath like an ocean. The newborn chimney below belched black smoke, laced with glitters of burning alloy. Good, the depot was cooking. But they still had to escape ground zero before the chain reaction touched the planet's volatile mantle and turned half the hemisphere into a pressure cooker. Altitude, 400 meters and climbing. Mara kicked thrusters to hard burn, pushing toward the pre-plotted evac corridor and atmospheric frontier, where relative cool breezes from the polar jet trimmed temperatures to survivable levels. Homing beacons set by stealth drones hours earlier pulsed in the darkening sky. All she needed was 4 minutes of flight to clear the radius. Then, Another stealth corvette locked in low orbit would snatch them via gravnet. The sky changed color, shifting from volcanic scarlet to a smoky mauve. Good sign, less particulate, cooler fires. Behind, something monumental ruptured. A mushroom of amber flame billowed upward, swirling tall enough to kiss the stratosphere. Shockwaves chased the dragons like mythical beasts. Mara felt the shove at her back, numbers spiking again. She flattened surfaces, letting the gust boost her speed. Her helmet display tallied signatures. Dragon 1 alive, Dragon 2 alive, 3 stacked, 4 green, 5 green, 6 green, 7 stacked. That meant Lynn and Ortega lost. She let grief lodge somewhere under the adrenal flood, marking it for later. Minutes blurred. She could almost believe they'd outrun destiny when warnings flashed anew. Enemy interceptors, 2 o'clock high. The Loyalists had gambled that someone might crawl out, and they were ready to swat stragglers. The fighters, repurposed atmospheric survey craft, carried twin rotary cannons loaded with ablative flechettes capable of shredding even adaptive armor, especially if heat had already fatigued it. "Form on me!" Zev barked. "Spiral defense!" The 5 troopers angled inward, shaping a corkscrew, their reflective wings offsetting each other to confuse targeting optics. The first burst of flechettes sparked off Mara's spine plates, carving luminous grooves. She bit back a curse, jinked left. Tran retaliated with a shoulder-launched coil rocket, but the round fizzled, guidance fried by ambient EM noise. Another burst. Dragon 5, Nara caught a stream full in the chest. The kinetic spray didn't pierce, but shoved her into a roll. A second burst clipped her wing membrane, tearing it. She spun, dropped like a maimed bird toward the swells of flame. Mara's throat tightened. Reflex overrode fear. She broke formation, dove after Nari, ignoring Zeb's snapped protest. Crosswind seethed, slamming her sideways. She throttled thrusters, closed the gap, and latched onto Nari's collar latch with one armored hand. Nari's visor flickered with static, but the woman was conscious, teeth bared. "Wings dead," Nari gasped. "Can't climb." "Then we glide the rest," Mari said. She triggered her own emergency webbing. Magnetic clamps on her hip fired a braided tether into Nari's harness. Wing loading doubled. Mara adjusted angles, turning herself into a keel. The extra mass dragged them, but also stabilized. Above, interceptors wheeled for another pass. They wouldn't risk the nuclear-level heat of the expanding fireball. They stayed at the edges, opportunistic hawks. A new symbol blinked. Extraction vector in range, 200 meters. Zev's ragged voice. "Corvette 63 is in position, gravnet deploying, 30-second window only." Mara glimpsed a sheen in the sky, a barely visible lattice of blue shimmering lines, crackling as it interacted with the Inferno's updrafts. She angled, hauling Nari. Each heartbeat hurt like hammer strikes. 80 meters, 40. The gravnet's field caught them like invisible molasses. Her stomach lurched as inertial dampers fought the sudden deceleration. Then the world folded. One frame they were skimming fire. The next they sailed upward in a lazy arc, dragged by the Corvette's winch. A bay door yawned, dull gray welcoming, and robotic grapples snagged both troopers, reeling them inside. Mara collapsed onto the deck, armor hissing as cooling sprays doused it. Her visor depolarized, revealing rough interior walls, quivering with structural stress. All around, technicians in fire-retardant smocks swarmed, yanking power couplings, plugging med feeds. She craned her head. Zeb, Tran, and Dragon 2 hollously nearby, battered but breathing. 5 souls out of 7. In core math, that was a bargain. A klaxon cut through. "Brace! Detonation echo inbound!" a crew chief yelled. Mara felt it more than heard it. An impact shudder that rippled through the Corvette's spine as the depot's chain explosion propagated into deeper magma vents. The planet roared like a wounded deity. Adaptive dampers groaned, but the hull held, And soon the corvette punched past the upper exosphere, rendezvousing with the waiting carrier, whose causeway lights glimmered like distant lanterns. Medics sliced open Mara's torso plating. Steam curled upward. Her skin beneath was mottled pink, but intact. She tried to sit. Someone pressed her down gently. Nearby, Zev removed his own cracked helmet. His buzz-cut hair sizzled at the tips, yet his grin shone star-white. He met Mara's eyes, wordless thanks passing between them, for the extractions, for the quick charges, for the reckless tether that saved Nari. A wall screen lit with live tactical feeds. Where Pyroxis' southern hemisphere once glowed in angry bands, a new pattern bloomed. Great dark patches where fuel-fed artillery had winked out. The blockade formation registered power losses across every quadrant. One by one, loyalist ships fired escape burns, choosing flight over a fight without munitions. Field officers on the carrier deck erupted in cheers. Mara let her eyelids drift, hearing the celebration dimly. Inside her mind she saw again the moment the alcove tore upward, the unmade tunnels disgorging flame, the magma and coolant mating to birth a spire that cracked the sky. She understood the scale of violence they'd unleashed, an entire planet's wounds, aggravated for strategic leverage. Someday a generation would reclaim Pyroxis and stare bewildered at the tortured crust, asking what manner of fury had done this. She hoped the history logs would remember the names of Len and Ortega, of all who'd fallen where no memorial could stand. She hoped the logs would also record why, so that in some cooler century, some student could weigh the cost against the freedom it purchased and decide whether the ledger balanced. The medic's voice hovered at the edge of consciousness. "You're stable, Sergeant. Core temp nominal. Rest now." Mara exhaled. The whisper of her breath fogged in the chilled bay air. The heat of Pyroxis felt far away, yet her bones still held its ghost, humming like distant artillery. She surrendered to the litter's embrace, letting exhaustion claim her. Feet first into the fire. Find the beating heart. Cut it clean. Mission complete. Operation Scorch Ribbon had burned itself into history, and so had the Dragon's 7 plunging stars, seared but unextinguished, carving the impossible into done.